Well, the final section in Moritz, where he discusses the variety of interpretations of what it means to say that human beings are created in God's image, is on page 203. And he just stayed consistent with the image of God in humans. I don't know why. The image of God in humans as God's election of the human race. You can already tell. I mean, that God's election of humanity is about God calling or acting in a certain way toward humans, and really has nothing to do with the image of God as something in the human. It may seem like I'm being nitpicky about this, but I really do think that the language of image of God in the human being or in man or in humanity just puts us off in the wrong direction every time. Every time. Now, I think I like this little last section, although I don't think it adds too much. Really, when we've talked about God calling humans to a particular role or function in the world, and that function has to do with the way in which they relate and care for the more than human world as God's primary representative in the creaturely realm. We're touching really on this whole last idea of God's election. So he quotes a Hebrew scholar named Nathan MacDonald just shortly after that new heading. A more convincing and consistent exegesis means like active interpretation of Genesis 1, establishes a link between election and the image. Especially when we remember that election throughout the Bible, I think this is something we can say is pretty much a biblical rule, that God's election of a person or a people is inevitably for the sake of, something or someone more than simply that person or people. So election isn't about me being sort of an end in myself or special. It's about God calling or electing, like me or us, to some kind of purpose or, again, function in the world for the sake of other creatures. And again, in Genesis 1, it really is for the sake of, I would say, the other eretz, land animals, the birds of the sky, the fish of the sea, and so on. He says at the top of 204, and it's like he wants to keep all of these various possibilities. I don't like the physical resemblance one at all, nor do I really like the substantive one, which is like the image of God in, and then figuring out what the substance or faculty or ability is that is the image of God. But he says the physical resemblance, this top of 204, comma, substantive, comma, functional and relational interpretations can all be seen as emerging from and can actually be unified through viewing the image and likeness of God as God's choosing or election of the human species as a whole. Well, God's choosing or election of the human species as a whole does not necessitate a physical resemblance idea. So I take that one off the table. The other ones, well, and I feel the same way about the substantive. Here's the thing I have been neglecting to say, though, that we should probably say. So I like the functional. Of these lists, it's not just that I like it, I'm persuaded that it's the best way to understand Genesis 1. For that matter, you want a really nice, I think we've discussed this, it's certainly in Renewal and Love, but a psalm that really reflects on these same issues is Psalm 8. Psalm 8's the one that actually says, what is Adam? What is the human being Or what is humanity that you, O God, would be even aware of us? We're so small, compared to everything else that we can see. Why would you even bother with us? And the answer isn't, oh, because you have eternal souls, or oh, because you have reason, or, you have this capacity that makes you so special. It's actually just that it says God has placed all creatures underneath Adam's feet. It takes us back to Genesis 1 and the idea of ruling in the place of God, or representing God. And then, of course, let's add that so much hangs on what we think this God is like, that we're supposed to represent. Like, is God's rule a hard-fisted, tight-fisted authoritarian rule? Well, Christianity would say, not if Jesus is the ultimate revelation of God. Jesus himself characterized himself as gentle and humble in heart. And when he said that, according to Matthew, it's found only in Matthew because, well, we know why. But as I said in class, I think to you, I'm persuaded that when Jesus said that, I am gentle and humble in heart, he's speaking not simply as like a nice, gentle, first century Jewish Galilean guy. He's speaking as divine wisdom incarnate, divine wisdom as a human being in our midst. And so it's not just about Jesus being a gentle and humble personality. It's actually about divine wisdom itself, i.e. God. God being gentle and humble in heart. If God is gentle and humble in heart, which everything in Jesus' own life and teaching would substantiate, then to be created in God's image, or created to reflect or represent such a God, would mean that humans at their best, at their most human, are gentle and humble in heart in relationship to not just one another, and again in Genesis 1, not even primarily one another, but like toward other creatures, like Coco, or, not just our pets, but like that's the one that's closest to me now. But when I put bird feed out in our bird feeders for the birds, from the biblical perspective, this is, God is the one who feeds creatures, but human beings created in God's image have this like kind of calling, this expectation that we will represent, stand in for God as ourselves, creatures in the world, fellow creatures with dogs and birds and kitty cats, and have I mentioned pelicans? Yes, I know I have. So that's an election. That is God's election of human beings for that purpose. On 204, let me read a little bit because I think it's pretty good. How are we doing on time? Okay. This is the new paragraph in the middle of 204. When perceived in the light of the original linguistic, historical, and cultural context of the Hebrew theological framework of biblical election, the image and likeness of God in humans, can I just go, is not essentially recognized by reference to any capacities, qualities, skills, behaviors, or even souls, like in humans. Did he not catch at least the irony of this, if not the downright contradictory nature of that language? Rather, the image of God emerges as a designation given through the free historical action of God, of God's own choosing of Homo sapiens, like our ancestors, and his calling them out from among the multiplicity of life forms that he also created from the dust, to serve as God's representatives to creation and to uphold God's justice and orient the creation towards fellowship with God. Now he's going to come back to that in a minute, and I'm going to touch on it some more a little in a second. But I like this. Let's just say real quickly. So if we go with this kind of functional or election, I think the election is really the same thing as the functional notion. Then from there we can talk about attributes of the human or capacities, characteristics. In other words, it may well be that in order to function in this way in the world, it really is beneficial that human beings have a degree of reason that makes it possible for us to create languages, for example, and to communicate with one another and to pass on knowledge. This is actually a very important evolutionary advantage, that human beings, as social creatures with a certain capacity of reason / language, culture making, are able to sort of share together in the process of learning. We don't start at square one when we're born. We become educated, first, within our own family and then schools, and then you educated college students. This is part of what makes human beings sort of special and unique. Can other creatures go to school? Yeah. And I think we're trying to do that with some of our, relatives. And I think it's a wonderful thing. God loves all creatures with an everlasting love. I think this is a really important thing to say. At least I want to say I believe this. And the Wesleyan tradition, which isn't the only tradition in Christianity, but the Wesleyan tradition insists on this, that God is pure universal love, loves indiscriminately all creatures and all creation. Now, creatures' capacity to receive that love, understand that love, communicate that love, will vary. It varies. It varies exceedingly, to use another John Wesley phrase. And that's okay. Humans, and it varies among humans. We're aware of this. But the main idea would be God is always seeking creaturely response to divine love. I mean, there may be ways that elephants and lions and maybe think of some of our more advanced mammals, elephants, chimpanzees. There are theologians that actually kind of work with chimps and observation and communication, and I'm not trying to say they're a bunch of theologians, but we should recognize that there are degrees of awareness, very possibly, of God and the presence of God and the love of God in all creatures and among all creatures. But according to the Bible, the human being has a special and unique calling, at which point some of our abilities come into play. But we ought not to identify those abilities with the image of God, whether it's freedom, reason, creativity, imagination, language, our capacity to imagine various futures. All of these are ways that people have at times talked about the image of God. It would be better to say the image of God is a calling, a responsibility, a kind of activity or function that human beings are gifted with. And it's all human beings, and it's all human beings together. It's not something we do individually. We do it as Adam, which is a collective, or at least we're supposed to. And and it's in relationship to the rest of creation. I'll just say one. So we have near the end of this section, he says, the election of humans is not a testimony to the superiority of Homo sapiens, but rather a witness to God's sovereign grace and love. As the elected high priests of creations, Homo sapiens are called to intercede before God for the sake of the entire created realm. I would say not just intercede, but actually act in God's behalf as the creator to protect creation, with the ultimate aim that all creatures should live in God's presence. I would just like to say, here's where I will end. I wrote, they already do. Creatures already live in God's presence. Our job as humans is to contribute to their flourishing, their wellness, their health and flourishing in God's presence. Wow, that went long. I'm now done.